And welcome again to the Southern Ohio Museum and Cultural Center. We want to thank the Ohio Arts Council and the Scioto Foundation for making these videos possible. We are up in our Wertz gallery looking at our vessels, and in the earlier vessel videos we talk about the long time span that humans have had making clay vessels. So long that in fact we've given clay vessels names of human attributes. We have the lip. The rim of the piece is called the lip. If there's a long cylindrical piece, there is a neck to the vessel. There's shoulders and bellies and then a foot. And so here humans have had this relationship with vessels for so long, we've named them after humans. Are what, Emily, 1,000 to 2,000 years old?
Yeah. The Wertz collection is our collection of over 10,000 prehistoric Native American artifacts, and here we're looking at a selection of vessels that date anywhere from at least 2,000 to 1,000 years ago. I had some questions, because if you look at vessels in what would be prehistory here in North America, like in the Bible, they have a lot of rules for what people were allowed to do with their vessels, and what things were allowed to be put in them, at what point were you supposed to discard them and throw them away.
Oh, that's interesting.
So, like,
yeah.
would these even hold water? Like, how do you have to fire in order for something to be watertight or to be able to hold and be a vessel?
Right. So once a piece of pottery is fired, it is on earth forever, in perpetuity. And in examining those shards, archaeologists are able to unpack a lot about that culture. And one of it, which is how high their firing temperatures got to, how high they were able to fire. The Chinese were able to fire their porcelain at such high temperatures far earlier than any other humans on earth. And so certainly the higher it's fired, the more vitreous it is. So what do I mean by vitreous?
Yeah, what's that
mean?
And
vitreous is non-porous. And so perhaps some of these rules of how long you could use a vessel would actually be because of health reasons. That if they were porous and absorbed food substances, you would then get bacteria growing.
Yeah.
And so you kind of wonder if perhaps that was a very early health standard.
Right, it makes sense.
So you can see a lot of this black smokiness is the carbon from the early fires. From when they were firing them, usually on a bed of shells, and those shells we believe are tempered. Correct, Emily?
Yeah, they use shell temper in most of the woodland pottery that we see.
Right.
And then we also have some other vessels. This one is actually from the Mogollon culture by the Gila River in New Mexico, and they used a grit temper. And this bowl was found in a mound in South Portsmouth, Ohio, or not Ohio, in Kentucky, South Portsmouth.
Temper is a substance that's, or an element that's already been fired. So they were pre-firing shells or sand or grit to get rid of actually a chemically combined water, the H2O, when it's bound with other chemicals within that clay. And so they could then add it to the clay and they would have a greater success rate and less crackage. And we know that now in today's technology, but for them to have figured that out so many centuries ago, it is very, very impressive. Some of my favorites are these really wonderful smaller vessels with the animal forms on them. In the first vessels video, we had animal forms.
This bottle from the Arlington edition is really interesting because it has the slip decoration on the outside of it, which looks a lot more like what we would think of as like tableware. All of our plates are glazed.
Right.
So is that going to make any difference for the functionality of that vessel, or is it just decoration?
Well, so what that is actually a slip. It's almost like they have floated down. They've gotten the very fine particles and coated the outside of that clay with the finer particles, and then it's gone through a series of rubbings, of burnishings. We call it burnishing, which renders it very shiny, almost like a glazed surface. But that's really attained just by rubbing the surface when it's just kind of right before it's bone dry. So right after it's been created and it's drying, and it gets to be this leather hard state, and so it's rubbed that surface is rubbed. We see that a lot in New Mexico.
See those a little bit on some of these ones too, which are kind of southern style, what you might see in Tennessee or Alabama, northern Alabama. But there are a lot of connections between the people that lived here, and they had trade networks that went across the entire continent. So it's really impressive, not just their technology, but just their footprint.
At the highway, we had the Ohio River right out in front, and that really was the traffic highway going back and forth. And I've always been fascinated by these little straps on the sides of these. Obviously, whatever they ran through, it was flat and thin. They weren't making a round rope, an animal skin, a strip of an animal skin or something.
Do you think these were sturdy enough to cook with on a daily basis, or were they more like a serving jar?
That's a really good question. And looking at all of the carbon left on this, I would have guessed this would have been used repeatedly in fires. So thank you for joining us. Do you want to add anything else?
No, thank you. I'm just it's amazing to me the artistry and the attention that they paid to aesthetics for something that had such an important practical use for them. They were no less paying attention to aesthetics than Clarence Holbrook Carter.
Right.